Most Christians believe the Bible teaches one place called hell. It doesn't. Not in Hebrew, not in Greek, not even once. Open the English Bible sitting on your shelf, and the word is there. Depending on which translation you own, it appears 10 times or 30 or 54. It is printed in red letters. It is preached from pulpits. It is carved into the imagination of nearly every believer who has ever opened Scripture in English. Now open the Hebrew scroll that stands behind those pages. The word is not there. It cannot be there. The language has no such word, and neither does the Greek. What is there, dear, buried under a single English syllable, is something far stranger and far more interesting than most of us were ever told. Because behind that one word, in the manuscripts there are four different words from 3 different languages, written across roughly 1,000 years of history, each one carrying its own geography, its own emotional weight, its own picture in the mind of the person who first heard it spoken. And for most of the last 400 years, English Bibles have printed all 4 of them using the same 4 letters. This is not a conspiracy. There is no villain in this story. The men who made those choices were, in many cases, brilliant scholars who died for the right to put Scripture in ordinary hands. But something happened in the process of moving these texts across languages, something quiet, something almost invisible. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Certain verses stop meaning what you always assumed they meant, not less. Different. If you want to understand what the biblical authors were actually saying, not what centuries of English translation trained you to assume, subscribe. This channel exists for people who would rather read the text than repeat the summary. That's the whole promise. Now, let's begin with the question that started this investigation. If the Bible never used one single word for hell, why does our Bible use only one? To answer that, we have to start somewhere unexpected. Not in Jerusalem, not in Athens. In England. Because before we ask what the Hebrew and the Greek meant, we have to ask a question almost nobody asks. Where did the English word hell even come from? It is not a biblical word. It never was. It is Old English. Hell or helle. And it comes into the language from the ancient Germanic and Norse world, long before any missionary carried a Latin Bible into Northern Europe. Its root carries the sense of covering, concealing, hiding. The same root that gives us words about things being buried, sealed, put out of sight. In the Norse religious world, hell was also a name, a shadowed realm of the dead, and the figure who ruled it. Think about what that means for a moment. When the first English translators reached for a word to render what they found in Hebrew and Greek, they reached for a word their listeners already understood, a word with a pre-existing shape, a word that already came with pictures attached. That is not deception. Every translator for his story has been born to do. There is no such thing as a neutral word, but it does mean this. At the moment those manuscripts were carried into English, they were pouring biblical content into a pagan northern container. And containers have shapes. Shapes bend what you pour into them. So the picture most of us inherited, a single, permanent, subterranean place of fire, uniform across the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. That picture did not come to us purely from the text. It came to us partly from the word we use it to translate the text, which raises the obvious question. If hell was the container, what exactly was poured into it? Here is where the investigation actually begins. Turn to the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, the writings of Moses, David, Solomon, the prophets, roughly 1,000 years of literature. And in all of that literature, there is exactly one word that English Bibles have historically rendered as hell, Sheol. It appears around 65 times. And the first thing you notice is not what it means. The first thing you notice is what the translators did with it. In the King James Version, Sheol is translated hell 31 times. It is translated the grave 31 times, and the pit 3 times. The same word, in the same book, by the same translators. Split almost perfectly down the middle between two completely different English concepts. Sit with that head for a second, because it is genuinely remarkable. Somewhere in the process, a decision was being made, verse by verse, about which face this word would wear. And that decision was not being made by the Hebrew. The Hebrew says Sheol every time. So what is Sheol? The honest answer, and this is where it gets fascinating, is that the Hebrew Bible never gives us a definition. It never stops to explain. It simply assumes you know. What we have instead are dozens of glimpses, scattered across poetry and narrative and prophecy like fragments of a photograph. And when you lay those fragments side by side, a picture emerges that most irrigators have never been shown. Start with Genesis chapter 37. Jacob has just been handed his son Joseph's coat, soaked in blood. He believes his favorite child has been torn apart by a wild animal. His other children try to comfort him, and he refuses to be comforted. And he says something that should stop every English rider cold. He says he will go down to Sheol to his son, mourning. Read that again. This is Jacob, the patriarch, the man who wrestled with God and was renamed Israel, the man whose name is stitched into the identity of an entire people. And he says that when he dies, he is going to Sheol, the very word English Bibles elsewhere translate as hell, not as a punishment, not as a fear, as an expectation. Now, notice what happens in your mind if you replace the word. If Genesis 37 read, "I will go down to hell to my son," half of Christian theology would collapse on contact, which is precisely why the translators didn't render it that way there. They rendered it the grave. But the Hebrew word is identical to the one they rendered hell 31 other times. And Jacob is not an isolated case. Job, described by God himself as blameless and upright, longs for Sheol as a place of rest from his suffering. He describes it as somewhere the weary are at peace, where the small and the great are alike, where the prisoner no longer hears the voice of the taskmaster. The writer of Ecclesiastes says that in Sheol there is no work, no planning, no knowledge, no wisdom. The Psalms describe it as silent, a land of stillness where the dead do not praise. Do you see the shape forming? Sheol in the Hebrew Bible is not primarily a courtroom. It is not primarily a furnace. It is the realm of the dead, all the dead. It is downward. It is dark. It is quiet. And it is universal. Kings go there. Prophets go there. Patriarchs go there. It is spoken of with grief, with dread, with weariness, but it is spoken of as a destination for humanity, not as a sentence for the wicked alone. And once you see that, one of the most famous scenes in the entire Old Testament suddenly reads differently. Jonah, swallowed by the great fish, sinking in the dark. And from inside that darkness he prays, and he says he cried out from the belly of Sheol. He is not dead. He is not being punished in the afterlife. He is in a place of total darkness, total helplessness, total separation from the world of the living. And Sheol is the word his prayer reaches for. That tells you something the dictionaries can't. It tells you how the word felt to a Hebrew speaker. It was the language of drowning, of being swallowed, of going down into a place from which no one climbs back up on his own. So here is the tension we now have to hold. We have a Hebrew word that describes the shared destiny of the dead, used of the righteous and the wicked alike, and English Bibles rendered it hell 31 times and the grave 31 times. Something is missing from that picture, and you can feel it. Because if Sheol were only a neutral grave, why did the prophets speak of it with such terror? Why does Isaiah describe it stirring itself to meet the arriving king of Babylon? Why does the psalmist plead so desperately not to be abandoned there? There is a shadow over this word that grave doesn't capture, and a mercy in it that hell destroys. The Hebrew Bible, it turns out, leaves Sheol deliberately unfinished. An open question. A darkness the text does not fully illuminate. And for centuries, the question stayed open. Then something happened, roughly 200 years before Jesus was born, that changed everything about how this word would be read forever after. A group of Jewish scholars, working in the great Greek-speaking city of Alexandria, sat down to do something no one had ever done at that scale. They were going to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and when they reached the word Sheol, they had to make a choice. The choice they made would echo through the New Testament, through the Church Fathers, through the creeds, and straight into the Bible you own today. They chose a word that did not come from Israel at all. They chose the name of a Greek god. The city was Alexandria. The century was the 3rd before Christ, and the project was, by any measure, one of the most consequential acts of translation in human history. Greek had become the language of the known world. Alexander's conquests had left it stretched from Macedonia to the edge of India, and an entire generation of Jewish families living outside Judea were growing up speaking it as their mother tongue. They could pray in Hebrew. Many of them could no longer read it. So the scriptures were carried into Greek. That translation is called in the Septuagint. And it matters enormously because it is the version most first-century Jews actually used. It is the version quoted again and again by the writers of the New Testament. And when those translators reached Sheol, they reached for a Greek word, Hades. Now, to us, that word arrives already glowing with mythology. Hades, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, lord of the underworld, the god who carried Persephone down into the dark, a river, a ferryman, a 3-headed dog at the gate. That is the baggage the word carries in our imagination. But watch carefully what the translators were doing, because it is subtler than it looks. In Greek usage, Hades had long since stopped being purely the name of a deity. It had become the ordinary word for the unseen realm of the dead, the place just the person. Some ancient writers even connected the name to the idea of the unseen, the invisible, the hidden, which means the Alexandrian translators chose a word that matched Sheol almost perfectly in function. The shadowed, downward, universal destination of the dead, the place where everyone goes. They were not importing Greek mythology into the Bible. They were finding the closest available container. But here is the thing about containers. They leak. Because Greek readers did not arrive at that word empty-handed. They came carrying centuries of Homer. They came carrying poets and playwrights and funeral customs and the whole architecture of the classical underworld. And over the following 2 centuries, in the space between the Old Testament and the New, Jewish thought about the afterlife did not stand still. Writings from that period, texts circulating widely among Jews in the generations just before Jesus, begin describing the realm of the dead as divided. Compartments, chambers, a place where the righteous wait in comfort and the wicked wait in distress, both of them awaiting a judgment that has not yet come. Notice the word waiting. That is the crucial idea, and it is the one most easily lost. Because this is the world Jesus was born into. This is the vocabulary in the air when he opened his mouth to teach. So when you reach Luke chapter 16, the rich man and Lazarus, and you read that the rich man died and was buried, and in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, you are not reading about a place the English word hell describes. You are reading about the intermediate realm of the dead, described exactly the way first-century Jewish listeners would have expected. Divided, conscious, with the righteous in one condition and the wicked in another, and a fixed separation between them. And there is a detail in that passage that almost nobody notices. The final judgment has not happened yet. The rich man's brothers are still alive. He asks that someone be sent to warn them. The story is set in the meantime, in the waiting room, not the verdict. Now hold that thought, because it makes the next piece of evidence almost impossible to ignore. Go to Revelation chapter 20. The dead are standing before the throne. The books are opened. And then comes a line that, if Hades simply meant hell, makes no sense whatsoever. Death and Hades give up the dead that are in them, and then death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. Read that slowly. Hades is not the final destination. Hades is emptied, and then Hades itself is destroyed. You cannot throw hell into hell. The text is describing the end of the waiting place, not the beginning of the punishment. 2 different realities, 1 English word. And that single collapse, that one editorial decision, repeated across centuries of printing, is why most readers have never noticed the distinction the biblical authors were carefully maintaining. But we are still not at the heart of this, because there is another word. And this one does not come from Hebrew poetry or from Greek philosophy. This one comes from a place you could walk to, an actual valley with actual coordinates on the southern and western edge of Jerusalem. You can stand in it today. You can photograph it. Tourists drive past it without knowing what they are looking at. Its Hebrew name was Gehinnom, the valley of the son of Hinnom. In Aramaic, the everyday spoken language of first-century Judea, that name softened into Gehinnom, into Greek letters, it became Gehenna, and it is the word Jesus uses more than any other. This changes the entire investigation, and here is why. Sheol and Hades are conceptual words, words about the unseen. But when Jesus said Gehenna to a crowd standing in Jerusalem, he was pointing at a place they could see from where they stood. Imagine that. Imagine a preacher today standing in a city and naming a specific street, a place with a reputation, a place with a history everyone in the crowd already carries in their memory. Nobody in that crowd needs the reference explained. They flinch before he finishes the sentence. So, what happened in that valley? The Hebrew Scriptures tell us, and they do not soften it. In the books of Kings and Chronicles, and again in Jeremiah, we are told that in that valley the people of Judah built high places, and there they burned their sons and daughters in the fire as offerings to foreign gods. 2 kings of Judah are named as having done this with their own children. That is not legend. That is the indictment the prophets laid against their own nation. And Jeremiah says something extraordinary about it. He records God saying that this was something he never commanded, and that it never even entered his heart. Then Jeremiah delivers the sentence. He says the valley will no longer be called by its old name. It will be called the Valley of Slaughter. The dead will be buried there until there is no room left. The bodies will become food for the birds of the air, and there will be no one to frighten the birds away. That is the image. That is what was hanging in the air behind the word. Not a metaphor about the afterlife. A national memory of horror. A place where the covenant people burned their own children, and where the prophets declared the corpses of a coming judgment would be piled. Now, you have almost certainly heard the popular explanation that in Jesus' day, this valley was Jerusalem's perpetually burning garbage dump, where refuse and animal carcasses and the bodies of criminals smoldered day and night. It is a vivid picture, and it is repeated in countless sermons and study notes. Honesty requires a note here. That specific claim is not well attested in ancient sources. It appears in a Jewish commentary written many centuries after the New Testament, and archaeologists have not confirmed it. It may be true, it may be a later tradition, but here is what is striking. The burning dump detail is not necessary. The valley's reputation was already established in Scripture itself, long before the garbage story appeared. Jeremiah had already made it the address of slaughter and unburied bodies. That was more than enough. Which brings us to the first-century listener. When Jesus warned about Gehenna, a Jewish crowd did not picture a Greek underworld. They pictured fire in a specific valley. They pictured child sacrifice and prophetic judgment. They pictured the dishonored dead lying unburied, which in that culture was among the most terrible fates imaginable. A body without a grave, a name without a memorial. Sheol was where everyone goes. Gehenna was the place of final ruin, of judgment carried out, of destruction that leaves nothing standing. They are not the same idea. They were never the same idea. And in Greek, they are not even the same word. Yet English Bibles, for centuries, printed both as hell. Which means that when you read Jesus' warning about Gehenna, and then read Peter preaching that Jesus' soul was not abandoned in Hades, you are reading 2 entirely different claims in 2 entirely different registers, flattened into one syllable that erases the difference. Now, Pause here for a moment because I want to ask you something. If this is landing, if you are sitting there realizing you have read these verses your whole life without knowing there were 4 different words underneath them, leave a comment and tell me which one surprised you most. And if you want more investigations like this one, hit the like button. It genuinely determines whether this kind of work reaches anyone else. Now, we have Sheol, we have Hades, we have Gehenna. 3 words, 3 completely different pictures, but there is a 4th. And the 4th appears exactly once in the entire Bible. 1 verse, 1 occurrence, written by a fisherman from Galilee. And the word he uses is not Hebrew. It is not Aramaic. It is the deepest and most feared level of the Greek cosmos, a word borrowed straight out of Homer. And the reason he used it is one of the strangest details in the New Testament. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. The sentence is short. Most readers move through it in about 4 seconds. It says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to hell, delivering them into chains of darkness to be kept until judgment. That word, the one printed as hell, is not Sheol. It is not Hades. It is not Gehenna. In the Greek, it is a verb built on the noun Tartarus. And Tartarus does not belong to the Hebrew scriptures at all. It belongs to Homer. In Greek cosmology, Tartarus was not simply the underworld. It was the abyss beneath the underworld, as far below Hades, one ancient poet wrote, as earth is below heaven. It was where ordinary dead men went. It was a prison, and it held a very specific class of prisoner, rebellious divine beings. The Titans, powers who had risen against the order of heaven and been thrown down and locked away. Now read Peter's sentence again with that in your ears. He is not talking about human beings. He says it explicitly. Angels who sinned. He is not describing a destination for the human dead. He is describing a holding cell for rebel spirits, bound in darkness, reserved, that is his word, until a judgment still ahead. And to say it, he reached past his own scriptural vocabulary and picked up the single word in the Greek language that already meant precisely that. Think about what kind of writer does that. Peter is writing to people scattered across a Greek-speaking world. He needs them to understand not just that something happened, but what kind of place is involved. So he chooses the one word his readers cannot possibly misunderstand. That is not carelessness. That is precision. And in English, that precision vanishes into the same 4 letters used for Jacob mourning his son. So now put the 4 side by side, not as a list, but as a set of pictures. Sheol, the shadowed, downward, universal realm of the dead in Hebrew thought, where Jacob expected to go, where Job longed for rest, silent, still, shared by kings and beggars alike. Hades, the Greek word chosen to carry Sheol across the language barrier, and by the 1st century understood as a waiting place, conscious, divided, temporary, a realm that Revelation says will itself be emptied and destroyed. Gehenna, not a concept at all, but a valley, a real place with a real address and a memory of child sacrifice and prophetic slaughter. The language of final ruin, spoken by a teacher pointing at ground his listeners had walked on. Tartarus, used once for rebel angels, borrowed from Greek cosmology to name a prison for powers awaiting trial. 4 words, 4 different authors, 4 different centuries, 4 different pictures, 1 English word. And now watch what happens to the verses you thought you knew. Psalm 16. David writes that God will not abandon his soul to Sheol. Peter quotes it at Pentecost in the Greek, using Hades, and applies it to the resurrection of Christ. The claim is that Jesus entered the realm of the dead and was not left there. That is a statement about death being unable to hold him. Translate it hell, and you have accidentally created an entirely different doctrine out of a verse about resurrection. Matthew 16. Jesus tells Peter that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. Gates are not offensive weapons. Gates hold things in. The image is of death's fortress failing to keep its prisoners, the church advancing against the domain of the dead itself. Print, hell, there. And the picture inverts into something defensive and vague. Matthew 10. Jesus says not to fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but to fear the one able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Here the word is the valley. Here it is judgment and destruction and finality. This is not the waiting room. This is the verdict. Same English word in all the 3. 3 completely different claims. And here, right here, is where I have to be careful, because this is the moment where investigations like this one usually go wrong. Some people take these 4 words and use them to argue that hell does not exist. Others use them to argue that it does, exactly as they already pictured it. Both sides tend to reach their conclusion faster than the evidence allows. So, let me say plainly what this evidence does and does not establish. It does not establish that judgment is unreal. Jesus spoke about Gehenna more than anyone else in Scripture, and he spoke about it with unmistakable seriousness. Nothing here softens that. It does not establish that the translators acted in bad faith. Every translator in history has faced the same impossible task. No 2 languages divide reality the same way, and something is always lost. What it establishes is narrower and in some ways heavier. It establishes that the biblical authors were making distinctions, careful, deliberate, meaningful distinctions, and that our English tradition collapsed those distinctions into a single word, which brings us to the real discovery, not the one you might expect. The discovery is not that there are 4 words. The discovery is what happened when we stopped seeing them, because when every one of those words became hell, we did not simply lose vocabulary. We lost the ability to hear what each author was actually trying to say. We stopped hearing Jacob's grief as grief. We stopped hearing Job's exhaustion as a longing for rest. We stopped hearing Jesus point at a valley outside the city wall. We stopped hearing Peter reach for the one Greek word that would make his readers understand. Every one of those men chose his word for a reason. Every one of them was communicating something specific to people who would have caught it instantly. And somewhere between their languages and ours, the signal flattened. That is the loss, not a doctrine, a layer, an entire layer of the Bible, the layer where the writers are being precise, went quiet. And this is where the whole investigation turns from history into something closer to reverence. Because there is a conviction underneath all of this that most Christians hold without examining it. That God chose to reveal himself through words, not through impressions, not through vague feelings, through language, spoken into specific cultures, in specific centuries, by specific people who chose specific terms. If that is true, then the words are not packaging around the message. They are the message, which means that reading carefully is not an academic exercise. It is an act of respect. It is taking seriously that when God spoke, he did not speak approximately, and there is something quietly freeing in that. Because the instinct behind a study like this is not fear. It is not about becoming more afraid of hell or less afraid of it. It is about no longer being satisfied with a summary of Scripture when the Scripture itself is right there. The goal is not to win an argument about the afterlife. The goal is to hear what the text says, in its own words, in its own world, at its own volume. That is available to you. It always was. You do not need Greek. You do not need seminary. You need the willingness to slow down and ask one question that most readers never ask. Which word is actually here? Ask that once, and you cannot stop. Because Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus are not an exception. They are a sample. If you got something out of this, leave a comment. I read them, and the questions people ask often become the next investigation. And if you want more of these, hit like. It's a small thing, but it's the difference between us being 100 people and reaching 100,000. So here is the question I want to leave you with. For 400 years, English readers have opened these pages and seen one word, and behind it, without knowing, four different pictures, 4 different worlds, hidden not by anyone's malice, but simply by the limits of translation. One word did that, one. So what about the others? What about world? What about eternal? What about soul? What about love? How many of the words you read this morning were carrying more than one meaning underneath? And how much of Scripture have we been reading past without ever noticing? The video appearing on your screen right now is the next piece of this investigation. It follows the same thread into a passage you have almost certainly heard read at a funeral, and shows you what the Greek actually says. Start there. Because once you begin reading the words themselves, the Bible stops being a book you already know, and starts being one you are finally discovering.